Hello and welcome to the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast with me, Clive Barber, and my good mate, Noel Tom. For the days when you can't ride your bike, there's always the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast. Hello everybody, welcome to this special edition, second podcast this week. This is an EICMA special with our man in Milan. He's not really our man, he's just out there making a load of videos for himself for his own YouTube channel, and he said he'd be delighted to have a chat with us and tell us all about the trail and adventure motorbikes that have caught his eye. So we're delighted and very grateful to welcome Andre Bajaria from Peak Motorcycles, direct from his hotel room in Milan, while he finishes off editing about 50 videos that he's done for his YouTube channel, Peak Motorcycles. If you want to find out more information about any of the bikes that is mentioned, you want to see them in video, go and subscribe to Andre's channel and have a look. He is producing some really interesting stuff over the next few days. Right, let's get on with it. So I'm delighted to welcome Andre from Peak Motorcycles, all the way, not from the peaks, but from Milan. Andre is currently sitting in his hotel, editing videos as quick as he can to get them out this week, whilst the show is still ongoing. So Andre, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Really appreciate it. What's been the highlight of the show so far for you from a trail and adventure motorbike perspective?
Hey Clive, great to be back on, and honestly after editing I think 16 videos I've got through this morning, taking a break from just editing and staring at my computer screen for a different reason is quite a refreshing change.
And you got my beautiful face too.
Hey, well nothing's perfect, right? But we get by. I can minimise that at least. What's been a real highlight for me is actually seeing the big change in the industry. You know, for a long time you'd get 125s and then you'd get lots of big adventure bikes, and the big adventure bikes were getting bigger. You know, 1000s, 1100s, 1200s, 1300s, and it just kept going. And sometimes they didn't change that much. You could sell a new adventure bike at 250, 260 kilos, and that was what people were really interested in. You know, you're lucky if you found a few enduros here and there, but not a lot lower down. It started last year, and then this year it's just absolutely just taken off. Nearly everyone now, you know, the new bikes, the new press conferences, they're about 300s, 400s, 450s. You know, people are realizing that you don't need to spend 25 grand on an adventure bike, 6 grand, 7 grand, you know, that sort of price range. And it's also, they're not just, I suppose, cheap and cheerful throwaway bikes. You know, the quality of them is coming up, the technology that's in them, things like tubeless wheels, which used to be, I suppose, the preserve of the higher cost bikes, are now filtering all the way down through the ranges, even the electronics. I'm seeing bikes that have, for sort of £5,000 and £6,000, that have ride-by-wire throttles and riding modes. Even the suspension, Clive, I know you've got a CRF 300, as have I, and it's a great bike, but the suspension's terrible. And I think when that came out, you know, Honda were making the bikes to a budget. I think the Vosges 300, when that came out, was pretty good. Also has pretty terrible suspension out of the box. Here this year, I'm seeing bikes in that category that are coming out with fully adjustable forks, you know, suspension that's fully adjustable. And even when someone who's as healthy as me gets on one of them, I don't feel like it's going to bottom out even before I've started riding. So just to see that shift in the industry from big, heavy, expensive motorcycles, which, you know, are probably the favoured options for middle-aged men.
They're not really anymore. For people that actually trail ride and do go on these longer adventures, one of the bikes you showed was the new KTM 1390. And I've written down the utter irrelevance of the KTM 1390. To me, I'm sure it's an absolutely fantastic bike, bristling with tech. What's it, about 170, 190 brake horsepower?
170 brake, yeah.
Just, why? What do you want that for?
Did you see the size of the screen on it? It's like a television. It's not like just a big screen that's a bit dodgy. It's super bright. Wouldn't be surprised if it's OLED. That's really, you know, how far you can push it. It's the same with looking at the new GS Adventure. It's nuts.
They're £20,000+ I've currently got in my family. I've got a car. My 2 older sons have got a car. My wife has a van. I didn't pay £20,000 for all of those, let alone on one leisure vehicle. To me, would be mostly unusable until I go down to the Alps once a year.
You know, when we get up to those sorts of powers, you know, I think on a track is the only place where you can use that. Even a 300, a 350, certainly a 400 upwards will sit quite happily at, legal speeds on the motorway. I mean, it's not even that much fun. I mean, who actually wants to ride a bike on a motorway anyway for any length of time? And yeah, sometimes it's a means to an end. That northern bit of France is a bit flat, and the sooner you get through it, the better. But, it's that thing, do you buy a bike for what you need 5% of the time, or what you enjoy doing 95% of the time? And I think even riding them, when you can lose your license in first gear, is it not more fun to ride a slow bike fast than a fast bike slow?
Absolutely. I think you're right. That was my thoughts as well. And we're going to talk specifically about some of the bikes that coincidentally we've both been very interested in. I've been asking the question for years. I've wanted a CRF, but I want a 400 CRF L or a 400 CRF Rally. Why hasn't Honda built that? Now, obviously, KTM and Suzuki, who we'll talk about both of those bikes, seem to be filling that gap. I was always told it was to do with difficult to get something out because of emissions, and obviously that isn't the case if they've managed to do it.
There are a couple of things with that, though, and this has come up as a result of some of the comments I've had on the videos so far. And I was aware of the 48 horsepower license restriction for an A2 bike, but linked to that is that it has to be no more than 0.26 of a horsepower per kilo, which essentially means you can't make 150 kilo 45 horsepower bike and have it A2 compliant. You can have it so you can ride it on a full license, but if it's 45 horsepower, you're essentially looking at 185 kilos as the minimum weight. And for every horsepower you drop, you can lose 4 kilos off the weight. I wouldn't be surprised if something like a CRF 300 is right on the limit of A2 restrictions. You could probably go up to maybe 30 horsepower, something like that. Or manufacturers just need to decide, yeah, you know what, we'll make these bikes light, you'll need a full license, and we will restrict them even further down to 30 something if people want to be A2 compliant.
Before we get onto the specifics, I wanted to talk about electronics, because I think that scares a lot of people. I mean, in my BMW car that is 10 years old, there's quite a lot of electronics in that. If anything goes wrong, the car generally tells me about it, but it's also a pain in the neck because it'll restrict you can't use sport mode if a tyre is down on pressure and things like that, safety kind of stuff. I had the discs and pads changed, and the guy in the garage didn't reset the disc and the pad meter, so it still showed us that the pads were worn down. And I know he fitted a new pad detection thing as well, but he didn't know how to reset things. The point I'm getting to is electronics scare me a little bit. I would much rather have simplicity. I don't want rider modes. If I've got a rider mode, it just stays in sport.
I think it depends on the bike as well, though. If you've got a 170 horsepower KTM 1390 Super Adventure and it's pouring with rain, you might not want to have 190 horsepower at your wrist. If you're buying a bike that's 45 horsepower, I don't think you need it. I don't think you need the maps. You'd leave it on full power all the time. Even things like traction control, especially on a trail bike, don't really get the point. You'll just be turning it. I mean, if it's really easy to turn off and it stays off when you turn the ignition off, that's not so bad.
My other point is I think motorcycle manufacturers need to do a better job with their electronics as well. If electronics was dodgy, we'd have planes falling out of the sky all the time. Electronics work on aeroplanes. They should work better on motorbikes, in my opinion, as well. I'm not an electrical engineer, though, so I have no idea what I'm talking about. Let's get on to some specific bikes. Which are the most exciting ones for you?
I have a list. I think I had, 10 bikes, 11 bikes on my list. So should we start with the big yellow elephant in the room? Finally, Suzuki have updated the DR to something they can sell in Europe. So I think if you're in the US or Australia, you can buy DR400s and DR600s. And you can buy them today. You could walk into a dealer in the US and buy a DR650 off the shelf. We've not had them since, I think, 2009 because they don't meet the emissions regulations. And we've had a real scarcity of dual sports. I mean, you get a CRF 250 and a 300, but that's been pretty much it for the last 15 years. The new DRZ 4S, and they have the SM, which is the Supermoto version. It's essentially the same bike. Few things which aren't ideal. Still got a 5-speed gearbox because it's got the same gearbox from the original bike, but they have done a whole load of work to it. It's got fuel injection. It's no longer carbed. It does have a load of electronics. It does have traction control. It does have rider modes. It does have ABS. It does have an LED headlamp, so at least you'll be able to ride it at night. Having said all of that, I think it looks great. I think it's really positive for Europe that manufacturers are investing in the development to bring these bikes back. Yes, it would be nicer if it had a 6th gear. Yes, it would be nicer if they'd managed to keep it to the weight. A few people have commented that after all this time, after 15 years of work, we get the same bike with the same 5 gears and 10 kilos of weight. If it's fuel injected, all the electronics, all of that adds weight. I'm sure the liquid cooling probably adds some weight.
You're right there. There's a lot of comments that I've seen. It's like, oh, it's only a 5-speed. And I'm kind of thinking, well, I don't care what gear I'm in. I always want another one. If I'm in 6th gear, I always try and find a 7th. So that to me isn't a problem because you just rev it more, right?
Likewise. And it does have, the power's there. What I'd hope is that there's a nice spacing between 4th and 5th. In that, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, you can use up to a decent speed when riding trails. 4th will get you up to 5th, and you could cruise at 5th without revving the nuts off it. But as a bike, it's still pretty lightweight compared to anything else that's out there, and it is going to be launched worldwide. So we'll have it in Europe. It does still look old. It looks like the old one. I'm sure that also means there'll be a lot of parts, a lot of aftermarket parts for it that will still fit it. Not that we have any of those in the UK, having, given that it died out 15 years ago. Hopefully Yamaha will see that. Hopefully the bike will be a big success. Yamaha will go, hang on, do we need to bring a WR250, 350, 450, whatever to the European market? People are buying that. And maybe this is what's going to change the focus away from 1200, 1300, 1400 adventure bikes, more dual sports, more things for the people that listen to this podcast, particularly. We are the most important after all.
To me, anyway. I love them all very much. The other thing I would talk about was Suzuki reliability, because DRZs have now got a reputation for being problematic. And it was like, well, yeah, of course they are. They're all 25 years old. It's inevitable. Whereas I think a study I looked at from the US had Suzuki down as the second most reliable bikes, second to a joint Yamaha and Honda. There is plenty of reliability there. It's just because the ones we see now are really old. The weight will be important. It sounds like they've managed to reduce that by 10 kilos, did you say?
I think it's gone up by 10 kilos.
Oh, it's gone up by 10 kilos.
It's still light by compared to anything else in that class.
And then the service intervals, I'm assuming, will be, standard road bike type 5,000 mile type service interval.
Yeah, it's definitely not an enduro.
Yeah, I'm glad to see it back. And it also might mean that there'll be a lot of CRFs available far more cheaply on the second-hand market.
Well, especially now that the new CRF is out. The new CRF wasn't actually on my list, but we can talk about why it wasn't. So I just looked it up, 151 kilos.
Right, well, that's the same as a CRF then, isn't it, effectively?
It is, but with, I think, 15 horsepower more. Honda have updated the CRF 300 for this year. Do you know what you get on the update?
Stickers.
Come on the L, you get an LED headlamp, like's been available on the Thai bike from the outset.
And on the Rally.
On the Rally, you get stickers, a bit more blue than was on it before. You get the LED headlamp, which it always had, and you get the LED indicators, which we've always had in the UK.
Talking about stickers, you don't need more blue, you need more glue, because they just fucking jet wash off.
Yeah, and I think they've tweaked the engine to be Euro 5 Plus compliant, which it has to be from January.
Well, hopefully Honda get the message and increase it by 100cc or 150cc as well for next year.
That would be lovely. They have a 350 motor they could put in it now as well from some of their other bikes.
Okay, so that's that. I can see that being a massive success in the UK amongst our people.
The only thing that I think might cause a bit of a hiccup is the price. There's a lot of competition now in that sort of £7,000 bracket. I think someone had mentioned it might be like €9,000, and I thought if that's right and it's £8,000, that is a little steep. If it's 6.5, 7, then I think it'll do very well. Less than that is also fine. But yeah, I think if it's sort of 6.5-ish, that would be pretty good.
I would expect it to be a little bit more expensive than the CRF 300L.
Yeah, but even they're looking pretty expensive. I have a CF Moto 450 MT, which is 5,700. Is it worth 1,000 more than that? Yeah, possibly, because it's 20 kilos lighter. Down on power as well, though. Is it worth 2,000 more? That's when it gets a bit tricky. Is it a third better with less power and that 5-speed gearbox? And I think that's when some of the purchasing decisions are going to, that might turn them.
You get a decent trials bike for £2,000. Right, what's next on your list?
Next on my list is a big bike for here anyway. The Aprilia Touareg 660 Rally. So I've always quite liked the 660 Rally. It never seems to be quite as popular, or you don't see as many of them as you do the Tenere 700s. Probably even see more Transalps out there. Lord knows why. But I always thought that was quite a good bike. It's up there around 200 kilos. But recently, Aprilia entered the Africa Eco race with one. They took a load of feedback from that and have put a load of those modifications into their production bike. So you can now buy a rally version. It's got a few changes. It's about 5 kilos lighter, even though it's now got a heavy duty bash plate on it. They've switched out the progressive springs for some linear springs. And apparently this greatly improves the handling off-road. Comes with a performance exhaust as well, saves a bit of weight, but still all road legal. And it looks great. They've got their Africa Eco race livery on it. And for a bike in that class, the T7, that does very well, especially in the hands of Paul Tarres. Yeah, I think the 660 is great, and I think that's going to do really well.
A few people mentioned to me they were hoping to see a 457 Touareg.
Yeah. And there were rumours of that. I was kind of hoping for that as well, but all we got was the 457 Tuono, the sort of naked bike. The next one, and this one maybe, is this allowed on the list? This is the BMW, the F450 GS.
That's on my list too. That's a concept bike, right?
It's a concept bike. So, BMW are not known for doing well in this class. They did have a bit of a go a few years ago with the G450X. There's still a few of them around, but not many. They showed the 450 GS concept bike, got similar styling to the new 1300 with that sort of cross-shaped front light. And yeah, it looks great. They said it's around 175 kilos. It's around 45 horsepower, which again, would just about be on the cusp of that A2 license restriction. No plans immediately for putting it into production, but that was really the only new thing that BMW showed. They did have the GS Adventures, which I guess came out over the summer, but there's probably far more interest in this 450 GS than there was in the 1300.
And that's a twin, isn't it? Again,
that's a twin, yeah.
Can I just say that new 1300 GS is one of the most ugly, ridiculous looking bikes I have ever seen. Yeah, possibly. Apart from that old 850 BMW that Noel's just bought, that's fucking ugly as well.
I had a good look at the 1300 at the show, and I reckon the bars with the handguards probably stick out maybe 10 or 15 centimetres only wide, and they're wide bars, and that's just how much they stick out outside of the engine. I mean, you look down, you can't see the ground. I'm sure people will buy it. People will trade in their 1250s for the 1300s. I'm sure if you spec it up, it's the wrong side of 25 grand as well.
Maybe they've got it right, and those kind of looks will grow on us. But I keep seeing it, and it's not growing on me. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
There is a horse for every cowboy.
No matter how ugly.
The fact that was getting that attention, BMW, was great. I think some people are getting very excited. I think a lot of big GS owners are looking for a small friend that can join theirs in the garage. It's going to come down to price and what they do about the A2 license restriction. If it's 175 kilos, I'm not sure how interesting it is, especially if it's going to be BMW prices and BMW servicing. If they can leave it at that power but drop the weight a bit, 160 kilos-ish, maybe people would pay 10 grand for the premium to do that. If it's going to be 8, 9, 10 grand as heavy as the rest with the same power as the rest and all you're buying is the badge, that is a tough sell.
Somebody else mentioned they were hoping to see a new version of an HP2 out as well, which I think would actually be quite exciting.
They had a little corridor down the back where they had an R18 and then some customs, and I did wander down there in the hope the R9T is now called the R12 line, using the last of the 1200 oil head engine. So I was kind of hoping that there'd be one of those tucked away. I mean, they've done that. Is it called a GS something? Street Scrambler? I can't remember what they called it. But yeah, they had like fork gaiters on and stuff, but it wasn't really an HP2. It was just an R9T in an off-road dress.
It's next on the list.
This is an odd one, completely unexpected. I'm sure you are very, very familiar with FB Mondial.
I've seen them at bike shows in the past, but it's one of those brands you just look at and...
You just look at it and you just walk past. They do lots of exciting looking, but until you get close, 125s. They were barely even on my list to go and visit. And I walked past and they had a sort of rally bike there. Not a proper rally bike, but kind of a CRF style of bike. And it's called an FB Mondial Mud 452. The engine casing says Mondial on it. Looks an awful lot like the engine that's in my 450 MT, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same 450cc parallel twin making about 44 horsepower. Now this is on my list because it looked good, right? The fit and finish on it was okay. There were the welding looked good, the paintwork wasn't sort of missing bits here and there, and the price they had on it was €5,500. So if that's under 5 grand, that's going to be BMW's problem. If you can buy another bike that's roughly the same weight, roughly the same power, similar sort of engine configuration for €5,500, so less than £5,000 if it comes to the UK for that price, that's actually going to do well. I mean, I think one of the challenges will be people finding out about it. Because as you say, it's a stand you walk past at a bike show. You wouldn't necessarily stop and have a look. Not sure about the name, a Mud 452. But still, it's not as bad as some of the names on this list. Definitely one of my bikes of the show and a complete surprise and unexpected. I'm never sure if you're going to be a bit sniffy about some of these things on my list, but let's see.
I might say some sniffy things, but I don't really mean it.
Right, should we talk orange?
Yep.
2 orange bikes. I think they are both worthy for inclusion. And this is the new KTM 390 platform. So KTM have had the 390 for a while. For a long time, there was a rumoured 490 twin, but given their relationship with CF Moto, I think that's essentially what the 450 MT has become. So KTM have been focused on doing something with a 390 platform. The outgoing bike always felt to me a bit like a road bike made to look like a trail bike. Didn't have the suspension travel, didn't have the ground clearance. I think they were made by Bajaj in India for KTM for that market. I know a few people that tried them found they were getting water inside the dashes, just some like niggling problems in the UK weather that we have. I don't think the old KTM was as good as it could have been. Now we have 2 new versions and they both look proper. So let's talk about the Adventure R first. It feels like a proper big bike. They have done the electronics to death on it. It's got a ride-by-wire throttle. It's got cruise control. It's got a fancy TFT dash, whether you need any of that stuff on a bike at this power. It looks good. The ergonomics on it, I'm 6'1", and to stand on it, it felt pretty comfortable, even without bar risers. There are a few downsides to it, and one is that, like every other manufacturer, KTM use platform engineering, where they develop a frame and an engine and then they put it in as many things as they can because it's the only way you can be competitive. That's how you keep your costs down. The problem for KTM is they've taken this engine from the Duke 390, the naked bike. And on a naked bike, it's absolutely no problem having the exhaust at the bottom of the bike because it saves weight, you don't need that extra pipe work, and it's fine down there. On the 390 Adventure R they had at the show, it had the Akrapovic exhaust on it. And it's about level with the pedals. It kind of feels wrong to be that low down on the bike. It's just behind your heels when you're on the pegs.
You want the weight low down on a road bike, but on a trail bike, you want as much ground clearance as you can get. From looking at the pictures, it looks like the exhaust sits within the frame of the bike, but that means the engine is jacked up within the frame by about 2 inches. So you're effectively losing 2 inches of ground clearance.
I don't know if you saw the pictures of the Enduro R that we'll talk about in a moment, but that's got another KTM power part on it, which is a Remus exhaust can, a Remus silencer. And that does stick up a little bit, but it's still, around maybe the height of the axle, the rear axle, maybe a little bit higher. If you want to be going through, even through a ford, certainly through a river, it is very low. Now, I know it's only the exhaust. As long as you go through, with the throttle open, you don't fall off. It can probably cope with a little bit of water, but it just seems a daft thing to put on a bike like that.
For me, that would totally put me off getting the new 390. I was quite excited about the new 390. Obviously, to cut costs, they've kept the routing of the exhaust where it is on the road bike rather than develop something new, and maybe it's a real squeeze to get it through the frame and up along with the through the subframe, but for me that's a total miss.
Other than the exhaust, and you know what, the aftermarket is booming for motorcycles. People like tinkering. I think whoever comes up with a high level exhaust is probably going to sell a lot of them, and it's probably going to become like a standard replacement everyone does who buys the bike. But it's a busy sector now. There's a lot of competing bikes, and if you're actually going to take it trail riding where you might have to go through water, that is enough to put a lot of people, including me, off. They have also brought out a KTM 390 Enduro R. And to me, this is like the Honda 300L and the 300 Rally. The Adventure is the Rally. The Enduro is effectively the L. So it's not a real proper Enduro bike. It's got that same 390 engine that's in the Duke and the Adventure, which I think means it has road bike levels of servicing commitment. And it looks good. It's comfortable to stand on. Doesn't have the big fairing, the big screen that you get on the Adventure R. Does have the same exhaust routing underneath the bike.
Disappointing.
I expect it'll be slightly lighter. I think it's probably got the same electronics package, probably got the same fly-by-wire throttle, may not have the cruise control, haven't looked at all the specs for it. But, for those people who, would like to have an Enduro bike but don't want the servicing and are willing to compromise a bit on the weight, then I think the Enduro R, I'm sure there'll be people that will be making windscreens and rally towers for it. So that is probably a more practical option. There's certainly fewer things to break when it falls over.
I think it's also worth mentioning there's the 125 version, which you showed in one of your videos on your Peak Motors YouTube channel. And for younger riders, that looks fantastic.
Yeah, it does. And thank you for the plug. I mean, it is Peak Motorcycles, but that's all right. Peak Motors is close enough.
Whatever.
Nobody's going to type the cycles. I know the 125 looks pretty similar in size and shape to the 390 Enduro. And yeah, for people who are getting into it, I think the only thing is going to be, again, what it costs. If it's £4,000 for the 125, maybe 5,000, maybe people will stretch to that. If it's going to be 6,000, that's maybe quite a lot for a learner bike. Maybe you just wait, spend the money on a test and buy the 390. It's good that they are investing this and developing the bikes at the lower end of the spectrum as well as the top end.
We're done on the orange ones.
Right then, should we talk about a bike from China?
Bikes from China, I mean, there's a whole discourse to be had there, but they are starting to look really good. You've got some very first-hand experience of a bike from China. You've had yours for over a year now, so it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about your experience with that as well.
I actually have two bikes from China. I bought a Cove 450 Rally. That was the Dakar bike made for the road. I bought the road-going version with the exhaust and the catalytic converter. And then just recently I've acquired a CF Moto 450 MT, which is, CF Moto, they're the company that make the twins for KTM. We know there have been some problems with soft cams on the 790 and 890. Hopefully the 450 MT won't suffer from the same. They use the same styling house that does the KTMs to design it. I love how it looks. I honestly can't tell you what it's like reliability-wise, as I've only had it for a month. But I think in terms of quality and build and, the weight and how they're actually set up, the newer bikes from the Chinese manufacturers are looking really good. Just looking at the number of people that were at the CF Moto stand and the Vosges stand at EICMA, just shows just how much interest there is in these motorcycles. Having said that, there are still a lot of the older models. So this is models from maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago that seem to be available in every possible displacement: 500, 600, 650s, 700s, 800s, 900s, 1000s, and they're all 230 to 260 kilos. Some of them look a bit dated. I'm sure they'll find a market if they're £6,000 with luggage or £7,000 with luggage, but they're not going to set the world on fire, and I don't find them that exciting, really. One of the new launches this year was from Vosges. Now, I've ridden the Vosges 300 Rally, which I thought was a worthy competitor to the Honda. It was about 40% cheaper, but it doesn't say Honda on the side. It doesn't have the Honda reliability, say many Honda owners. And at the time when it came out, I had 3 Hondas. It's not that I'm anti-Honda, I'm very much pro-Honda, but at the same time, I know that the paint started rubbing off the frame on my CRF 300 Rally the second time I went out on it. If that had been a Chinese bike, it would have just had a huge amount of abuse based on build quality, but because it's Honda, it's kind of fine. You just buy some frame protectors and you move on. So the Vosges 800 Rally, it's a big bike. 24-litre fuel tank, 91 horsepower. It's got the proper size wheels, a 21 at the front and 18 at the back. Fully adjustable suspension. Now the weight is 213 kilos, which is quite a lot. Having said that, that's only, I think, 8 kilos more than a Tenere 700, 20 horsepower more, and I think it'll be under £8,000. That's based on the fact that the DS900X, which is Vosges' version of the BMW 900 GS, is £9,000 with luggage. Now, if you've not heard of Vosges, they are the brand of a company called Lonsin. And in the same way that CF Moto have been making engines for the KTM twins, Lonsin have been making engines for BMW, mostly the twins, the ones that used to go in the 650 and 800 GSs that became the 700 and the 850, and I think even the 900 now. So they've been working with BMW for 15 years. This isn't some new offshoring thing to produce bikes cheaply overseas. I think Lonsin do have a history. They've been doing this for 15 years. The work they're turning out now, looks really good. It doesn't just look like a copy of something else. And the Vosges 800 Rally, yeah, it could do with being a little bit lighter. But again, it's, I think for 8 kilos more than a Tenere 700, and that's with the bash guard, that's with everything on the bike already. I think it's pretty good in that middleweight sector.
The Chinese bike I really like the look of was the new Cove 800 adventure bike, which is kind of a stripped down version of, I think, a bike they've been producing for a while.
It was one of the bikes from last year, actually, which is why it wasn't on my list. But yeah, they've essentially made the one that comes with all the luggage and everything on it. They've made another version that is kind of the same but without the luggage, that's a little bit lighter. But they come with things like tubeless wheels as standard, and then they've done a rally version where I think they have a new subframe. They've replaced a lot of components with lighter materials. They've taken away the option to have a pillion. There's no pillion pegs on it, and as a result, with the lower mass of the bike, they don't need the second disc at the front. So they've really slimmed it down, and that I think is something like 180 kilos for an 800cc twin. They look great. What I don't know is how easy they'll be to get hold of. I think they were at the ABR festival this year showing them off, and I think they took a lot of orders then in the UK. So
how are you finding getting parts and service bits for your Cove?
When I bought my Cove, I got one of the first ones that came into the country. The importer is down near the south coast, which is a long way from me. I ordered a load of service parts when it arrived. Air filters, fuel filters, oil filters, and they were all easy to get hold of. They all came with the bike. I think the only thing I didn't have was spare brake levers, but they came a couple of weeks later. So far, I'm about halfway through my supply of filters, and I'm doing my own servicing. At the time, there weren't any dealers nearby. I think now they've got half a dozen dealers up and down the country that would do the servicing for them, but to be honest, it's pretty easy. You do have to disconnect the link pipe for the exhaust to get to the oil filters, but now I've done it a couple of times. It takes me about 20 minutes to do an oil change. Maybe when it comes to doing the valve clearances, I'll actually take it to, I think York is now my nearest dealer. I think Motorrad Connection up there do them. So maybe I'll go and see if they'll do the valve clearances the first time, and then maybe after that I'll try it myself. From a servicing perspective, it's been pretty easy. And as far as I'm aware, all of those sort of parts that break often are readily available in the UK.
What's the word on reliability? I haven't heard you mention any problems with yours, but what's the word on the forums, etc.?
I think people have been complaining a bit about the jerky throttle. There have been a couple of new ECU remaps that have come out. I know there's a guy who I actually met up with in Romania who's done something like 20,000 kilometres on one, and he's really put his through the ringer, and it's still going well. He's a Brit who's living out there. Again, I think it's one of those things, it's how you ride it and where you ride it. I mean, it's designed for the Dakar. So I think there was some confusion over what the real service intervals were. And I think if you are riding it full throttle over rough terrain, just shaking the thing around.
Like you do.
you know what? It's the only bike I've got that scares me. Every time I think I'm getting the hang of it, I realise that actually, no, I'm only riding at 30% or 40%, and it's got so much more to go.
We didn't mention the price of the Cove 800. It's about $8,500, isn't it?
About $8,500.
It's a lot of bike for $8,500. 90 brake horsepower, 800, 180 kilos. Yeah, that seems like a real contender to me. As well as the Cove 450 rally bike. I'd love one of those as well. Can't afford either. Already got 5 bikes in the garage. Probably not going to be able to change those for some time. But it's nice to dream. Where are we next?
So this was, again, another unexpected one. This is the Rieju, I think that's how you pronounce it. Rieju, it's probably called in the UK. Aventura Rally 307. This was a bike I wasn't expecting to see. I sort of saw it in passing as I walked past the Rieju stand. That's something a bit different. Now, I know they've got their 500, which is based on, I think, a Honda CB500 engine that's got these, I think, a 19 and a 21 litre fuel tank. I know that Nathan Millward has recently done a big trip on one to see just how far you could push it. But yeah, they've got this bike. It's a 307. It's not actually 307 cc's. It's a 293. Now, I believe the engine in this is the same engine that's in the Vosges 300 Rally. Not a new engine just for this bike. And again, it looks pretty good. I got to sit on it and stand on it and bounce up and down on it. There was a tall Dutch gent who's one of the dealers in the Netherlands, and he had a look at it. He was very impressed. And I think one of the key things is it looks like it's going to be priced lower, maybe sub £5,000. And the suspension out the box seems pretty good, even for someone of my weight. Again, lots of good stuff about the Hondas, but the suspension's not great if you're not 70 kilos. So if this comes like that out of the box, it also came with decent Michelin Enduro tyres on it. You know, it's not other tyres where people would get them and chop them out for something that works a bit better on the mud and the wet we have here in the UK. Really impressed. I think it was a 20.5 litre fuel tank that's on it, which is, you know, pretty big.
It's described on the Rieju website as Dakarian.
A bit like a Dakar bike, but not. I thought it looked good. If anything, standing up on it, it felt slightly small. But then again, when I do that on my CRF 300 Rally, probably feel exactly the same. It's nothing that probably bar risers or maybe a high bend bar wouldn't fix. So this one is maybe an odd one. This is the Hero X-Pulse 210.
This sounds quite interesting because Hero obviously aren't imported into the UK currently, but they're an Indian company. They used to be Hero Honda. So this small bike sounds quite interesting.
Well, you say small bike. So this is the bigger version, the upgraded version of the X-Pulse 200. So I think before those two versions, there was a 160 and a 200, which I know is a small bike for the UK. But in India, the 200 is at the bigger end and the 210 is the latest version. It's essentially a dual sport. It's basic. I think it's got a conventional fork. Doesn't have all the fancy electronics that we get on bikes over here. I think in India, they cost something like £1,500 new. So it is very much economically priced. I expect there'll be more than that if they do come to the UK. And Hero will be imported to the UK from next year. Now, I think at the moment they're going to be looking at the 440 single that's in the bike called, and don't laugh, it's called a Maverick. However, I really hope they bring the X-Pulse over as well, because if they could sell that in the UK for less than £2,000 as a 210cc dual sport without all that electronics that we talked about at the beginning, they are tried and tested in India. They are abused on the roads in India, over the mountains. People repair them at the side of the road. As things have got more sophisticated and more complicated, we talk about these bikes being cheap when they're £5,000, £6,000, £7,000. £8,500 for a Cove 800 is cheap. But that's still a chunk of money, right? When people are short on money or they don't want to spend a lot. If you were a new rider and a KTM 125 is going to set you back £5,000, an X-Pulse 210, if you've got your license, is going to set you back less than half that and essentially do the same job. That would be a nice choice to have.
Sounds really interesting. It'd be nice to see what bikes they eventually bring in.
The last two, I'm going to talk about them together because they are kind of similar. I think one will be available in the UK, the other one is unknown. Much like the Vosges 800 Rally, the first one is the CF Moto MTX. This is the big sibling to the 450 MT. Developed by CF Moto. It's essentially a KTM 790 underneath, hopefully with harder cams. And yeah, I look at it, it looks great. It's essentially a 790, but it has a bigger fuel tank. It seems to have bigger, it's got a bigger fork. It's got a 48mm fork instead of the 43. It comes with all the bells and whistles, all the electronics, the cornering ABS. What it doesn't have, I believe, is the KTM subscription model. You hear about this? You buy a KTM, it's got all these electronics, you get them for free for the first 3 months or something, or for the first X number of miles, and then after that, if you want them, you've got to pay.
That whole concept can fuck right off, as far as I'm concerned.
Generally, that means that you get them during the running-in period where you probably can't really use them. And then when you want them, that's when you've got to pay for them. And maybe that's what they're looking to do to make some money from it. But I think that is a real shame if that's the way they're going. So if you could buy the same bike, but with some uprated components, a bigger fuel tank, better suspension, for less money, that sounds like a winner to me. And some of it is, it doesn't have the KTM brand, but lately, I don't know, especially for those middle-sized twins, they don't have the best reputation for reliability and customer service. So if you could get something similar and better that ups that, then that can only be a good thing. The last bike is, again, kind of similar. It's another 800cc bike, and it's made by QJ Motor. Now, QJ Motor is one of these stands, and it's absolutely vast here at EICMA. I think they sell bikes to other brands that they then rebrand as their own. And they have a bike in every displacement. They have, like I say, 500, 600, 650s, 700, 750s, 800s, 900. And they all look kind of the same. When I get around to editing the video for this, I'll probably be a little bit awkward because I just kind of skim through them. However, one did stand out, and it's called an SRT 800 RX. I wouldn't be surprised if it's got a similar engine to what's in the Vosges. This makes 91 horsepower, and it has a curb weight of 198 kilos. So that's 7 kilos lighter than a Tenere 700 with 18 more horsepower. Still not a light bike, but for that class, that would be a class leader if it was available. It's lighter than the KTM, either the 790 or the 890. It's certainly lighter than the CF Moto. And what I don't know is if it's going to be available in the UK. And the reason I picked that one is that out of a big sea of 700, 800 and 900cc bikes, that one, at least on paper, had the lightest weight. Now, one thing I would say is that sometimes the weights have to be taken with a pinch of salt, because by the time they've made them Euro 5 plus compliant, maybe there's a bit of weight added. If they don't have the same size fuel tanks and you're comparing it full to full, you can easily add a couple of kilos here and there. Nevertheless, that is a step in the right direction. And if you think something like a Suzuki V-Strom 800, so it tips the scales at 230 kilos before you start adding bits to it, this at 198 is interesting.
There's going to be some fascinating changes, I think, in the industry based on the quality of bikes that China are producing. Perhaps that's why we're seeing some challenges now to the conventional manufacturers that are now actually starting to produce the smaller bikes as well that we've been asking for years. I think it's a direct correlation to us moaning on the podcast to the likes of Suzuki, etc., now producing the bikes that we want. I think it's all down to us.
Or it might just be that people don't have as much money in their pockets. I mean, there's been a lot of stuff in the press recently in the UK about some big dealership chains that have gone under. BMW, Triumph, Ducati, dealerships that have been established for many, many years, and people just aren't buying the bikes. People don't have as much money in their pockets. The interest rates have gone up, so there's not these PCP deals, which means that people can drop 20 grand on a bike every couple of years. The alternatives weren't very good. That wasn't ideal. But if you can suddenly buy competitive, well-made, powerful, good-looking bikes for half the price, suddenly spending that extra money on those established brands is more of a challenge. You know, they need to offer something more if they're going to charge twice as much.
Well, there you go. You're very welcome. We've just saved you the flight or the train fare all the way to Milan and an absolute fortune on hotels. You don't need to bother with the show. It's all on the podcast. Speaking of shows, we will be at Motorcycle Live, so we'll maybe see you there. I'll have some stickers on me, possibly, if I remember to take them. All right. See you soon. Thanks for listening. We really appreciate your support. Don't forget you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And if you really appreciate what we do, you could consider supporting us on Patreon or buy us a coffee. Links are available on our website, which is tampodcast.com, tampodcast.com, where we also have a limited selection of branded stuff. But either way, please keep listening and spreading the word. See you next time.